I want to tell you something that took me 57 years to understand, and I need you to stay with me, because the version of this story that sounds the most obvious is not the one that actually happened. It started with a phone. Specifically, it started with me sitting on the edge of a pull-out couch in my brother Gary's spare room at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, still in my work clothes, eating a sleeve of crackers, because I hadn't figured out my situation well enough to go to a grocery store yet. That's how recently my life had changed. I hadn't bought groceries. I was borrowing shampoo from Gary's wife Linda, who kept leaving fresh towels on the bathroom counter with the quiet, careful tenderness of someone who understands that a man, in this particular situation, does not need to be looked at directly. I'd been at Gary's for 5 days. 5 days since Claire had stood in our kitchen, that Tuesday, holding her coffee with both hands the way she always did when she had decided something, and told me she needed me to go. Not forever, she said. She said that. Not forever. She just needed space to figure out what she wanted. She was calm. That was the thing I kept returning to in Gary's spare room, how calm she had been. 29 years of marriage, and she'd said it the way you'd say you needed to reorganize a closet. Measured, certain, already decided. I didn't fight her. I don't know if that was dignity or defeat. Maybe both. I took a bag and I left, and I drove to Gary's house, and I told him what happened, and he said okay and made up the spare room without asking another question, which is what a good brother does. Now here I was, 5 days later. Crackers, pull-out couch. The particular indignity of a man in his late 50s sleeping on a mattress that folds out from inside a piece of furniture, in a room that still had Gary's golf trophies from 2004 lined up on the dresser like a small museum of better days. Gary had offered to move them, and I'd said leave it. I wasn't there for the aesthetics. I was there because I didn't have anywhere else to be, while I figured out what had happened to my life. 5 days is both a very short time and a very long time, depending on what's in it. Those 5 days had a quality I still find hard to describe. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. More like the blunt disorientation that comes when a structure you've been living inside suddenly isn't there anymore. You keep reaching for things that aren't where you left them. Habits built over decades running into air. I had a whole morning routine in our house that I'd performed without thinking for 20 years, and now that it was gone, I was discovering for the first time that every single piece of it had depended on being in that house. Which sounds obvious. It was not somehow obvious until it was gone. I was looking at my phone the way you look at something when you're too tired to put it down but too tired to actually use it. Just holding it. Screen lighting up with nothing that mattered. And then I remembered the camera. It came back to me the way forgotten things do. Sideways, through a smell or a sound or some idle corner of your brain that's been sitting with information you haven't asked for yet. 3 years ago, when our daughter Megan had her first baby, we put a nanny cam in the living room. She'd leave the baby with us on weekends, and I'd set it up so she could check in on her phone. After a while, Megan didn't need to check anymore. The baby got older. We got comfortable. But I'd never taken the camera down. It was just there. Small thing, no bigger than a pack of gum, tucked up on the bookshelf behind the ceramic owl Claire's mother had given us. We'd just stopped thinking about it. And it was still linked to my phone. I sat there for a long time before I opened the app. I want you to understand that. I didn't immediately open it. I thought about it. I turned it over, the way you turn a question over when you already half know the answer and you're not sure you're ready for the full version. There's a part of every man, I think it's the part that still wants to believe things are okay, that will hesitate at the door before opening it. Not because he's a coward, because he's human. I'm telling you this because what happened next mattered more than I knew, and how I handled what I found mattered more than anything I'd done in years. I opened the app. The feed was live, our living room, quiet and dim. the lamp on the side table glowing the same amber it always did at night. Empty. Claire wasn't in frame. The house looked exactly the way it always looked. My reading chair was there, the old brown armchair that Claire had wanted to throw out for 12 years and I'd refused to give up. It was still there. My coat was still on the hook by the door. Something about that coat almost undid me right there. I'd grabbed a different one on the way out. That coat was still hanging exactly where I'd left it, like the house wasn't sure I was gone. I went back to the beginning. 5 days of footage. I sat on that pull-out couch with my crackers, and I watched. I don't know what I expected to see. That's the honest answer. I'd been telling myself a story for weeks, months, if I'm being truthful, about what was happening to my marriage. Stories we tell ourselves are always clean. There's a villain. There's a victim. There's a reason, and the reason is someone else's fault. That's the story I had. It was a decent story. It made me the wronged party. It made the thing happening to me something being done to me, rather than something I'd helped build. What the camera showed me was different. What the camera showed me changed everything. But not in the way I expected. That's the part I need you to hold on to as I tell you this. Because if you think this is the story of a man who caught his wife doing something terrible, you've already gotten it wrong. This is a different kind of story. It's the kind where the surveillance camera does its job perfectly, catches every detail with total accuracy, and still manages to almost send a man in the wrong direction entirely. The truth I've come to understand is patient. It will wait for you. It will sit in frame, lit up, documented, right there on your phone screen. And it will still let you misread it completely. Because misreading is what we're built to do when we're afraid. I was afraid. And so I watched. And I misunderstood. And then, eventually, after a phone call with my daughter, after a very long drive, after the kind of silence that only arrives when you've finally stopped arguing with yourself, I understood. Let me take you back to day one. Claire and I met in the spring of 1994 at a hardware store, which is maybe the most honest origin story a contractor's marriage could have. She was buying grout. I was buying everything else. We stood in the same aisle for 20 minutes before I said anything, and when I finally did, I asked about the grout, which is not a romantic opener by any definition. But she laughed, which told me everything I needed to know about her. She was a steady woman. That's the word I'd use if I had to pick one. Not flashy, not loud, not the kind of person who made a room notice her the moment she walked in, but the kind who made you notice, eventually, that things ran better when she was in them. She had that quality of being quietly essential. A lot of people have presence. Claire had substance. I knew the difference even back then. I'd known enough women with presence to understand that substance was harder to find. We married in 1996. Built our house. I built most of it literally, with my crew, nights and weekends, by 1999. Megan came in 2000. And for a long time, we were good. I want to be clear about that. We were genuinely, solidly good. Not perfect. We argued about money, and we argued about my hours, and there was a stretch in Megan's teenage years where Claire and I were more like co-managers than spouses, coordinating pickups and crises and school events without much left over for each other. But we were good. She was the kind of woman who remembered the things you mentioned once in passing. If I said I'd been stressed about a specific client on a Tuesday, she'd ask about it on Friday without my bringing it up again. She kept a mental file of the things that mattered to the people she loved, and she checked back in on them, and she didn't make a show of doing it. That was just how she operated. It was so consistent that I stopped noticing it. That's what happens when a person is reliably good. You stop being able to see it, because it never disappears long enough to create contrast. I think I'd stopped seeing a lot of things. It started to shift around 2 years ago. I can see that now. At the time, I was calling it her going through something. That's what I told Gary. Claire's going through something. Which is what a man says when he doesn't want to be more specific, because being more specific would require him to examine his own role in the thing she's going through. She got quiet. Not cold, exactly. Claire was never cold. Not in the way people mean when they say that about someone, but she retreated. She stopped sharing. We'd have dinner and she'd ask about my day and listen to the answer and offer nothing in return about her own. I told myself she was tired. I told myself it was menopause, which I recognized as a cowardly thought the moment I had it. I told myself she'd come back around. She was also leaving on weekends sometimes. Not often. Every few weeks. She'd say she was going to see a friend, and I'd say okay, and she'd be gone Friday to Sunday, and come back quieter than when she left. I didn't push. I should have pushed. But when you've been married to someone for 26 years and you've built a rhythm with them, it's easier to stay in the rhythm than to stop and ask why it's changed. The rhythm becomes a kind of permission. As long as things are moving, you don't have to ask whether they're moving toward something good. That was the mistake, of course. But I didn't know it yet. Then came that Tuesday in the kitchen. She told me she needed space. I left. 5 days passed. And then I was on that pull-out couch, watching my own living room on a phone screen at midnight. Day 1. The footage from day 1 starts around 10 in the morning, about 2 hours after I'd driven away. Claire comes into the living room. She's still in her robe. She stands in the middle of the room, and she does nothing for almost a full minute. Just stands there. I'd never seen her stand like that. Hands loose at her sides, face completely still, like someone who has just set down something very heavy and hasn't decided yet whether to pick it up again. Then she sits on the couch, and she calls someone. I turned the volume up as far as it would go. The camera had decent audio, better than I'd remembered, and I could hear her side of the conversation clearly. Her voice was different. Not the measured, calm voice from the kitchen. This was thinner, strained at the edges. She said, "I did it. He's gone." And then she stopped talking while the other person responded. And then she said, "No, I'm not okay. Stop asking me if I'm okay." And then she cried. I need you to hold that image for a moment. Because in that moment, watching her from Gary's spare room, I didn't know what to do with it. She didn't sound relieved. She didn't sound like a woman who'd accomplished something she'd been planning. She sounded like someone who'd just done something that cost her something significant and wasn't sure she'd spent it right. I watched her cry for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching a timestamp. That's a strange thing. To watch your wife cry through a phone app and feel completely unable to reach through the screen, while also watching a timestamp tick upward like this, is just footage. Like this is just data. I told myself it meant nothing. Guilt, maybe. You can feel guilty about wanting something without it changing that you want it. Plenty of people cry after they do the difficult thing they'd already decided to do. I kept watching. Day 2 brought something I hadn't expected. A woman came to the house. Mid-morning. Claire opened the door, and they embraced, not the hello, how are you embrace of friends, but the kind of embrace that implies someone has been holding something difficult and has finally found a safe place to put it down. They sat at the kitchen table, which was just barely in frame. I could see the corner of the table, part of Claire's face, and the back of the woman's head. They talked for a long time. 2 hours. I couldn't hear most of it, they were too far from the camera. But I could see papers on the table. I could see the woman's hands moving, like she was explaining something. At one point, Claire nodded, and then nodded again, and then put both hands flat on the table in the gesture I recognized. It's what she does when she's accepting something she doesn't like, but has decided to accept. Who was this woman? I didn't recognize her. She wasn't one of Claire's friends. I knew Claire's friends. She wasn't Megan's age, wasn't older. Professional posture, careful way of listening. The way she sat suggested she spent a lot of time professionally listening. I had no idea what to make of this. I made something up to fill the space. That's what we do. We hate a blank, and we fill it. Day 2 ended, and I went to sleep on the pull-out couch. And I dreamed about something unrelated, which strikes me now as the brain's way of protecting you from what it knows is coming. Day 3 is where it got complicated. Day 3, early afternoon, Claire is alone in the house. She walks through the rooms slowly, not restlessly, not with purpose, but the way you walk through a place when you're trying to memorize it, or maybe trying to remember what it felt like before something changed. She comes into the living room, and she stops at my reading chair. She sits in it. She doesn't do anything else. Doesn't turn on the television. Doesn't pick up a book. She just sits in my chair with her feet on the floor and her hands folded in her lap, and she looks at the room. She does this for almost 20 minutes. Then she gets up, and she goes to the kitchen. And she opens the cabinet, and she takes out my coffee mug. It's a nothing mug, ceramic, white, with a chip on the handle I'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. It was my mug the way the armchair was my armchair, by repetition, by occupation, by the quiet agreements couples make about which things belong to which person. Claire had never used that mug in my memory. She had her own mug. She didn't need mine. She held it in both hands. Both hands, the way she'd held her coffee that morning in the kitchen when she'd told me to go. She turned it once, looked at it. Then she put it back in the cabinet, very carefully, like she was putting something away that she intended to find again. I had to set my phone down. That's the moment. Not the phone call on day 1, not the mysterious visitor on day 2. That's the moment where something in the story I'd been telling myself started to develop a crack. Because nothing about that image, my wife, alone in our kitchen, holding my chipped coffee mug with both hands like it was something irreplaceable, fit the story I was telling. The story I was telling didn't have that scene in it. The villain of my story didn't do that. But I wasn't done with day 3 yet. And day 3 had more to show me. Later that same afternoon, day 3, Claire gets a phone call. I know it's a phone call because she comes into the living room with her cell in her hand and she sits on the couch, which puts her close enough to the camera that I can hear most of what she says. Her posture changes when she answers. She straightens up, something lightens in her face, and she says, "Hey, yeah, I can talk." And then she laughs. I want to stop here and tell you what happens inside a person when they've spent 3 days watching footage that confused them, footage that made them feel guilty about being angry, footage that kept refusing to organize itself into the story they needed, and then they hear their wife laugh. Not a polite laugh, not the hollow kind. A genuine laugh, the full one I remembered from when she was happy. The kind that starts in her chest. Something in me went very cold. She said, "No, he's not here. It's fine. It's just me." And then she listened, and she laughed again. And she said, "Friday. Absolutely, I'll be there." And then, "Yeah, I know. He won't know, David. Stop worrying." And then she said, "I love you too." I put the phone face down on the mattress. I sat in the dark of Gary's spare room, and I did not move for a very long time. David, there it was. Isn't that what we've been waiting for? Isn't that the thing you suspected the moment I described a wife who's been disappearing on weekends? Isn't that the piece that makes all the other pieces fall into place? The retreat, the quiet, the mysterious visitor with the papers, and now a phone call where she laughs for the first time in days and says he won't know and says I love you? That's what I thought. On that pull-out couch, in that spare room, in the dark, I thought, there it is. That's the thing. 29 years. And there it is. I'm telling you what I thought, because I want you to feel the certainty of it. The absolute, locked in, makes total sense certainty of a conclusion that fits every fact you have available to you. That's the most dangerous kind of certainty, not the kind that comes from no evidence, but the kind that comes from evidence you're interpreting through a lens you don't even know you're wearing. The mind is extraordinary at this. It does it seamlessly, without announcing itself, without offering you the option to slow down. You have data, and the data is real, and the story it builds from the data feels like the only story the data could possibly tell. There's even a kind of dark relief in it, the relief of finally having an answer. Because uncertainty is exhausting. You've been carrying "I don't know what's happening to my marriage" for weeks, and now you have something. Now you have a shape. The shape hurts, but shapes are better than the shapeless. You can put your hands around a shape. You can know what to do with it. I knew what to do with it. Or, I thought I did. I spent the next hour in Gary's spare room constructing things in my head, not consciously, not deliberately, but the way the mind starts sorting things into drawers when it thinks it knows what category it's dealing with. I thought about the weekends she'd been gone. I thought about the quiet. I thought about the visitor with the papers. The papers especially. Legal documents, I thought now. Arrangements being made. Things being organized. The whole shape of it clicking together into something I could hold. I thought about 29 years, and I had the specific feeling of someone who realizes they've been in a room they thought they understood, and it turns out there was a door they'd never seen. There's a particular quality to that kind of certainty. The certainty that arrives from real evidence, from things you actually saw and heard, that feels fundamentally different from the normal, fragile kind of believing. The normal kind, you know you might be wrong. This kind, you feel the impossibility of being wrong. The evidence is right there. You watched it. You heard it. You turned the volume up. What exactly is there to doubt? That's the trap, of course. That's the mechanism. The more real the evidence, the less willing you are to question how you're reading it. And so the mind locks, and the story hardens, and what was possibility becomes fact. And you start making decisions, emotional, practical, permanent decisions, based on a fact that isn't what it appears to be. And then, somewhere in that dark hour, something snagged. It was the coffee mug. I kept coming back to the coffee mug, the way she'd held it, both hands, like something irreplaceable, and the armchair, 20 minutes in my armchair looking at the room. These two things would not fit in the drawer I was building. They kept sliding out. They didn't belong to the story I was telling. I almost ignored them. That's the truth. I almost said, guilt makes people do strange things. I almost said, she's complicated, people are complicated, you can love someone, and also instead I called Megan. It was late. She was probably putting the baby down. She answered on the second ring because she's a good daughter, who answers when her father calls even when it's late. And her voice when she said "Dad" had that particular careful quality it had carried since this whole thing started. Like she was braced. I said, "Who's David?" There was a pause. Long enough to mean something. Short enough that she didn't hang up. She said, "Dad?" I said, "Just tell me who David is." Another pause. And then, very quietly, "Where did you hear that name?" "That doesn't matter right now." She took a breath. I could hear it. That specific breath that happens when someone is deciding how much truth to carry into the next sentence. Then she said, "You need to talk to Mom." I said, "I'm talking to you." And she said, finally, in the smallest voice. Not small because she's meek. Megan has never been meek, but small the way a voice gets. When it's carrying something it wasn't supposed to be carrying alone. David is Mom's brother. Uncle David. He lives in Phoenix. I didn't say anything. She kept going. The way you do when you've been holding something and someone finally opens the door. You don't walk through it carefully, you just go. He was diagnosed 4 months ago, stage 3. It's serious, Dad. It's really serious. Mom has been flying out there every couple of weekends to be with him. She didn't want to tell you because you were under so much pressure with the business, and she said you had enough. Megan's voice cracked slightly. She didn't want to put it on you. She was trying to protect you. I let that land. She's been doing this alone? For 4 months? Yes, and the woman who came to the house? On Wednesday? Megan was quiet. Then, you saw that? The camera. Megan, the nanny cam. It's still running. She made a sound that I think was something between a sob and a laugh, the sound of someone who has just understood something they probably should have understood earlier. That's her therapist. She's been seeing her since October. Since just after David's diagnosis. She fell apart, Dad. She held it together on the outside. She's good at that. You know she's good at that. But she needed somewhere to put it. She needed somewhere to put it. And she hadn't put it with me. I want you to sit with that for a moment the way I sat with it. Because there's a temptation, at this juncture in the story, to slide cleanly from one feeling to another, from wronged husband to understanding husband. To flip the switch. To say, I misunderstood, now I understand, we're good. But I didn't feel that. Not right away. What I felt was more complicated than that, and I think you deserve the complicated version. Because the complicated version is the one that actually did something useful to me. What I felt was relieved. Genuinely, fully relieved. There was no David. Not that David. The cold thing in my chest unlocked, and I could breathe again. That part came first, and I'm not ashamed of it. But underneath the relief was something harder. If Claire had been carrying her brother's illness alone for 4 months, alone, with a therapist, flying to Phoenix every other weekend, holding it together in this house where I lived, sitting at my kitchen table, making my coffee, and I had not known, not suspected, not noticed. What had I been paying attention to? I thought about the retreat, the quiet, the weekends she was gone. I'd labeled it her going through something, and I'd left it there, unexamined, the way you leave a box in the corner of a room, because opening it feels like more than you can deal with right now. I'd told myself I was giving her space. That's a generous way to describe looking away from someone you love. She had a dying brother, and I had called it her going through something. She had a therapist she'd been seeing for months because she had no other container for her grief, and I had been right there in the same house, and she hadn't felt she could bring it to me. That's the part I needed to stay with. Not the part where Claire had been secretive. The part where, somewhere in the years of our marriage, I had become someone she couldn't bring the difficult things to. I don't know exactly when that happened. I don't think there's a single moment I can point to. No fight, no door slammed, no specific failure. It's more insidious than that. It was the accumulated weight of 1,000 small absences. The yeah and the fine and the I'm tired, can we talk tomorrow? The way I'd gotten good at providing without being present. The way I'd convinced myself that keeping the bills paid and the house maintained was the same thing as being a husband, when those are not, in fact, the same thing. Claire had pushed me out of the house, and she'd done it. Megan explained this to me slowly, and she was crying by the end, because she was terrified, not of me, of losing me. She was watching her brother disappear a little at a time, and she'd looked at her marriage, and she'd seen a man who wasn't quite there anymore. And rather than watch it deteriorate slowly, rather than lose me gradually, the way grief takes things gradually, she'd made a cut, controlled the timeline. If he leaves on my terms, then I'm not left. I'm not watching it happen. I'm doing it. She'd lost her grip. And when people lose their grip, they do strange, self-protective, sometimes devastating things that make complete sense from the inside and look completely different from the outside. She thought she was pushing me away before I could disappear on her. She had no idea that the camera was still running. She had no idea that what it captured, every detail, in clear audio with a timestamp, was not what she thought it was capturing. After I got off the phone with Megan, I sat in the dark for a while longer. Then I opened the app again. But this time I wasn't looking for evidence of betrayal. That question had been answered. What I was looking for now was something harder to name. I kept scrolling back through the footage with a different eye. The way you reread a book after you know the ending, and you suddenly notice everything you missed the first time through. And that's when I found it. The footage from 3 days before I left. A Sunday afternoon, I could see myself in frame. I was in my reading chair with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, which is what I did on Sunday afternoons with a constancy that I'd mistaken for contentment. Claire came into the room. She was in the doorway, and she stood there for a moment. And then, she said something. The audio was faint at that distance, but I turned it up, and I could make it out. She said, "Ray, can I talk to you about something?" And on screen, without looking up from the paper, I said, "Yeah, what's up?" And she stood there a moment longer. I could see it, the hesitation of someone who has been carrying something for months and is finally standing at the edge of ready. And then she looked at me in the chair, and something in her face changed. A small change. The kind you'd miss if you weren't watching carefully. Her chin lowered slightly. Her shoulders drew in. The particular posture of someone who has just answered a question they hadn't asked yet and gotten an answer they were afraid of. And she said, "Never mind. It's nothing." And she walked back out of frame, and the man in the reading chair turned a page of the newspaper. I stared at that footage for a long time. The camera had caught it perfectly, every detail, clear as day. My wife had stood in that doorway with 4 months of grief in her hands, and said, "Can I talk to you?" And I had said yeah without looking up, and the yeah had been enough. The yeah had been all she needed to decide to close the door again. I don't know if I've ever felt anything quite like watching that. It's one thing to be told you failed someone. It's another thing entirely to watch yourself do it. In real time, on a phone screen, and understand that at the time you had no idea that anything was happening at all. That's the particular horror of the footage I'm describing to you. It wasn't that I'd been cruel. It wasn't a dramatic failure. No raised voices, no deliberate dismissal. It was just a man in a chair who said yeah without looking up, and a woman who looked at that yeah and made a decision about what it meant, and took her grief back to its corners. I scrolled back further, looking now, really looking, and I found more. Not dramatic footage, nothing that would hold up as evidence of anything to anyone but me. Smaller things. Claire setting a plate in front of me at dinner and watching my face for a moment before sitting down. Just a second, no more, and my eyes already back on my phone before she'd even made it to her chair. Claire in the hallway, one Saturday morning, wearing the green sweater she bought last winter and had barely worn, standing by the mirror, and me passing through without a word. Claire laughing at something on television, a real laugh, the full one, and me not looking up. How many of those were there? How long had I been the man who didn't look up? I didn't want to count. What had that camera actually recorded across those 5 days? It recorded her trying. It recorded her grief. It recorded her holding my coffee mug. It recorded the moment she finally decided to let herself cry. It recorded the therapist who'd been holding her together because she didn't believe I had room for the weight of her. It recorded David's phone call and her face when she heard his voice. Because I know now that sound, the lightness in her voice when she said hey to her brother, was the sound of a woman who was losing someone and trying to keep every moment with him. That laugh wasn't freedom. That was a woman desperate to feel normal for 60 seconds. But it also recorded me. 1 week before all of this began, Sunday afternoon, a man in a chair who said yeah without looking up. And that was the footage that changed everything. Because here's what I've learned in 57 years on this earth, and it is the lesson I would hand to every man I know, younger or older, married or not. Because it applies to nearly every relationship worth keeping. The most dangerous distance in a marriage isn't the kind where someone is across the room. It's the kind where you're in the same room and one of you is already somewhere else. I had been somewhere else for a long time. Not with another person. I wasn't that story. But I'd been somewhere inside the machinery of my own life. The business, the bills, the routine, in a way that had quietly built a wall between me and the person sitting 20 feet away. I hadn't noticed the wall because I was always on my side of it. From my side, everything looked fine. I was home every night. I was providing, I was available. That was what I told myself available meant. It didn't mean that. Availability is not the same as presence. I could fill a room with a man who answers yeah without looking up, and that room would be technically occupied and genuinely empty at the same time. Claire knew the difference. Claire had lived with that difference for long enough that when she finally needed to bring something enormous to me, she stood in the doorway and looked at my face and decided it wasn't safe. I sat with that until something in me settled. Not settled like resolved, settled like you settle into cold water, like you accept a temperature. Then I got up. I showered. I drove to a diner and had the first real meal I'd eaten in 5 days. And I sat in a booth by the window and I watched cars go by. And I thought about what I was going to do. Not what I was justified in doing. Not what I had the right to do. What I was going to do. As a man, as a husband, as someone who had watched himself on a phone screen turn a page of a newspaper at exactly the wrong moment. I thought about the version of me who had almost walked into that conversation with accusations, who had spent 20 minutes certain he understood the shape of his own life and had been wrong in every important dimension. I thought about how close I'd come. Just one more night of sitting in the dark, building the case in my head, letting the certainty harden into something I couldn't walk back. It is a strange thing to be grateful for your own hesitation, but I was. I called Gary. I said, I'm going back. He said, okay. He didn't ask questions. Like I said, good brother. I drove home. I didn't call Claire ahead of time. This was deliberate. Not dramatic. I wasn't staging a scene. I just knew that if I called first, she'd have time to reassemble. To put on the face she'd been wearing for the last several months. The composed face. The measured face. The one that kept things at arm's length. I didn't need to outmaneuver her. I just needed to get there before she had time to rebuild the wall. I pulled into our driveway at 4 in the afternoon. I sat in the car for a moment. I looked at the house. I'd built it with my own hands, or most of it with my crew's hands, which amounts to the same thing when it's your crew and your work and your life. I knew every corner of that structure, every beam and joint and place where we'd had to improvise. A building tells you things about the people who built it, if you know how to read it. This one told me about stubbornness and care, and a particular refusal to take shortcuts where shortcuts would have cost you later. I had built this house that way on purpose. I hadn't run my marriage that way. Then I walked to the front door, which was my front door, and I knocked on it, which still strikes me as one of the stranger things I have done in my adult life. To knock on the door of the house you built with your own hands. But it felt right. It felt like the right acknowledgement of what the last 5 days had been. A declaration. I know this isn't just mine to walk into right now. I'm asking. She opened the door. Whatever she expected, it wasn't just me. Standing there, no speech prepared, no anger on my face, just me. She said, Ray. I said, tell me about David. Her face did something I hadn't seen it do in a long time. It broke. Not in a dramatic way. Not a collapse. Not a scene. Claire doesn't do scenes. It was quieter than that. More like watching something that had been holding a particular shape for too long finally release it. The composed face, the face she'd been wearing like armor, just stopped working. And underneath it was the real one. The one that had been trying to hold her brother's illness and her marriage's fraying and her own grief, all at once, without telling me any of it. She put her hand over her mouth. I stepped through the door. I didn't touch her yet. I just walked into the house, our house, and I closed the door behind me. And I said, again, quietly, "Tell me about David." And she told me. It came out not as a speech, but as something messier and more honest than a speech. Fragments at first, then longer pieces, and then something closer to the whole thing. She'd found out in October. A call from David himself, who had downplayed it in the way that people downplay the things they need you to not panic about. And she'd known immediately that it was worse than he was saying, because she'd known David her whole life, and she knew how he minimized. She'd flown to Phoenix that same week. She'd sat with the oncologist, and she'd held her brother's hand, and she'd flown home on Sunday night and made dinner Monday morning. And I hadn't noticed. I hadn't noticed. "I was going to tell you," she said. She was sitting on the couch now, and I was in the armchair, my armchair, the one she'd been sitting in while she watched the empty house. "I was going to tell you that first week. I kept finding the moment, and then, I don't know, Ray, you were in the middle of something. Or you seemed tired. Or I'd start to say it and you'd look at your phone. Or you'd say 1 sec and I'd—" She stopped. She shook her head. "I kept not telling you. And it kept getting bigger," I said. Yeah, she looked at her hands. "It kept getting bigger, and the bigger it got, the harder it was to tell you, because then I had to explain why I hadn't told you yet, and that required explaining," she hesitated. "That you'd decided I wasn't a safe place to put it," I said. She looked up at me. I said, "I found the camera, Claire. I watched the footage." Something moved across her face, and I want to be precise here, because there are several emotions it could have been, and the one it actually was matters. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was closer to relief, like someone who has been walking around with a secret not because they wanted to keep it, but because they couldn't figure out how to share it, and now the decision has been made for them. She said, "How much did you watch?" "Most of it," I said. 5 days' worth. And the week before. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the Sunday afternoon. Yes. She looked away, out the window. Our neighbor's car was in the driveway, the ordinary world going on as it always does, completely indifferent to the particular weight of what was happening in our living room. She said, "I stood there for almost a minute, Ray." I said, "I know. I watched. I was going to tell you. I had decided. I thought, okay, I'm going to say it. I'm going to tell him about David, and I'm going to let him." She paused. "Let him be there. Because I needed someone to be there with me. And I looked at you, and you said yeah. And you didn't look up, and I just thought—" Another pause. "I thought, he can't. He's not." She stopped herself. "He's not available," I said. She looked back at me. I was going to say present. But yeah, I sat with that. It didn't feel good. I want to be honest with you about that. When the truth lands, it doesn't always land cleanly. Sometimes it lands like something blunt and solid. But I didn't move away from it. That's the thing I can say in my own defense. For maybe the first time in a long time, I didn't move away from something uncomfortable. I sat in it, and I said to myself, this is true. This is what happened. You can be angry about the way she handled it, and you can also accept that she handled it that way because of something you'd built over a long time. I said, you could have told me anyway. That wasn't fair to either of us. She nodded. No argument. You're right. I should have. I convinced myself that you were already halfway gone. That we were already— She pressed her lips together. I thought if I told you, and you gave me the yeah, I couldn't survive that. Not with David. So I started pulling back first. So at least it was me doing it. That's when I understood the whole of it. Not just the surface logic, the protecting herself from abandonment, but the depth of it. She had loved me long enough that the prospect of losing me had become something she needed to manage before it happened. When you love someone for 29 years, you lose the capacity to imagine surviving their absence. You just start making plans for it instead, the way you plan for a storm you're not sure you can withstand. You board up the windows. You pull in the things you can't afford to lose. You try to control the timeline of the damage. She'd boarded up the windows, and I'd been standing outside in the rain wondering why I couldn't get in. We sat there for a while, not fixing everything. That's not how 29 years works. You don't have one conversation and fix 29 years. What we were doing in that room was something more modest and more essential. We were reopening a door that had been closing for a long time, slowly enough that neither of us had really clocked the moment it shut. That's a different kind of work. Slower, less dramatic. It doesn't come with a moment where everything is resolved and the music swells. It comes with two people sitting in their living room, and one of them finally telling the truth, and the other one staying in the room for it. That's what staying looks like. It's not heroic. It doesn't photograph well. It's just two chairs and a decision to remain. Eventually I asked, "How is he?" "David. Scared," she said. "But fighting. He's got a good team. The next round of treatment is Friday." A pause. I was going to go. "Okay," I said. "I'm coming with you." She looked at me for a long moment. Not with relief, not right away. With something more searching, the look of someone who has been burned by a yeah without a look up and isn't quite ready to trust the full sentence. I understood that. I didn't push it. I just held her gaze and let the sentence stand on its own. Then she nodded. And something in her, just slightly, unclenched. We flew to Phoenix on Friday. I booked the tickets myself, which sounds simple but was its own kind of statement. I booked them under both our names. Round trip. 3 days. I told Claire only what was necessary. We leave Friday morning. I've arranged for someone to cover the business. We're staying at the hotel near the clinic that she'd been using. She looked at me for a long time when I told her. The look of someone recalibrating. I drove to the airport. We sat side by side at the gate and didn't talk much. Which was fine. Not every silence is a problem. Some silences are just two people being in the same place together without the pressure to perform, which is its own form of intimacy after a long time apart. I bought coffee. I handed her one. She said thank you in the quiet, ordinary way of someone who has learned not to make a big thing of small gestures, because making a big thing of them means acknowledging how long they'd been missing. We sat with David in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner. And David shook my hand and said, "Glad you're here, man," with the particular economy of a person who's learned not to waste words, and I said I should have been here earlier, and he looked at me and nodded. Because we both understood what that meant. I held Claire's hand in the waiting room for 4 hours. Not talking much. Not needing to. Just there. Here's what I think about now. When I think about all of it. I think about how certain I was. Sitting in Gary's spare room, in the dark, having watched everything, having all the facts, I was absolutely certain. The laugh. The name. The she said he won't know. I had it all. Every piece of evidence was accurate. The camera had not lied to me. The footage was real. The audio was clear, and I was still wrong. Not because the evidence was bad. Because evidence never exists in a vacuum. Evidence exists inside a story, and the story I was telling made perfect sense of everything I saw. It arranged every detail into a pattern that was coherent and emotionally satisfying in the specific way that being wronged is sometimes emotionally satisfying. Because at least you understand. At least there's a reason. At least the other person is the villain and not the mirror. I wasn't wronged. I was reflected. That's the thing about a camera. It doesn't know what you're looking for. It doesn't care what story you walked in with. It just records what's in the room. And what was in the room, from the very beginning, was a woman who was in pain, who needed her husband, and a husband who had learned to occupy space without inhabiting it. I almost turned that footage into a weapon. I almost used it as proof of the thing I'd already decided was true. I almost drove from Gary's spare room into a conversation with Claire that would have been devastating and wrong in every direction. Accusations built on real evidence, real events, real footage, and completely false conclusions. The camera didn't save my marriage. I want to be clear about that. I saved my marriage, and so did Claire, and mostly we saved it by finally stopping the thing we'd both been doing. Me by looking away, her by pulling back, and doing the difficult, unglamorous work of actually being in the room together. The camera just accelerated the moment, put me in the position of having to reckon with things I might have put off for months or years more. But reckoning with things is always the work. The camera just removed my options for avoiding it. I've thought about what to say to you, if I could say anything, from the other side of that week in Gary's spare room. I've thought about it because I've watched other men go through versions of what I went through, and what I've noticed is this. The version we tell ourselves is always more comfortable than the version that's true. Not because we're liars, because we're human, and being human means building a story that makes sense of our pain. And the stories that make sense of our pain almost always make someone else the primary architect of it. I've been turning this story over for 2 years now. That's how long it's been since that week in Gary's spare room. Long enough that I can see all the shapes in it. The one I almost became. The one I chose instead. The small distance between them that I almost didn't navigate. The man who goes back with accusations is not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He's a man who trusted what he saw, which is a reasonable thing to do. He looked at real footage, heard real audio, drew a logical conclusion from real evidence, and he was wrong, but not stupidly wrong. He was wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when they interpret information through pain, which is to say, entirely human, entirely understandable, and in this case catastrophically mistaken. I was that man for about 18 hours, and then something in me, some instinct, some thread of doubt that the coffee mug had planted and Megan's voice had confirmed, kept me from walking all the way into that version of things. I am grateful, in a way that I can't fully articulate, for that thread of doubt. I've gone back to those 5 days in my mind more times than I can count, and there's a moment I keep returning to. Not the coffee mug, not the Sunday afternoon footage, not even the phone call. Just the simple fact of what the camera was doing while I was building my case. Recording, patiently, without an agenda, without a story to protect. It didn't know who the villain was supposed to be. It didn't know what conclusion I needed. It didn't understand the structure of a betrayal narrative or the emotional requirements of a wronged husband. It just sat on that bookshelf behind the ceramic owl, drawing power from its little cable, and it recorded whatever was in the room. And what was in the room was a woman who had needed her husband and hadn't known how to reach him. And a husband who, on the footage from 1 week before any of this began, had been right there, physically, literally, present in the same square footage, and still somehow managed to be completely unreachable. I've thought about what it would have meant to not find that footage. To have gone forward with the story I'd built, certain of its accuracy, armed with evidence, absolutely convinced. I think about that version of events with something close to dread. Not because the confrontation would have gone badly, though it would have, but because I would have spent years believing the wrong thing. And the wrong belief, held long enough, becomes a kind of wall. You stop being able to see past it. And here's what I understand now that I didn't understand then. A wall built on a false premise is not a neutral thing. It doesn't just separate you from the wrong conclusion, it separates you from the right one too. Once you've decided you know what happened, you stop looking, you stop listening. The story closes, and everything that contradicts it gets reinterpreted or ignored or filed away as suspicious, because the mind is extraordinarily loyal to its own conclusions. I was 24 hours away from closing the story. The camera didn't let me build that wall. Not because it caught what I feared it had caught. Because it caught what I'd refused to see. I'm not telling you that the other person is never at fault. Sometimes they are. Sometimes what the camera catches is exactly what you feared it was, and then you deal with that, and it's terrible, and you survive it. I'm not here to tell you that betrayal doesn't exist, or that trust is never broken, or that the answer is always to look at yourself. But I will tell you this. If you are sitting somewhere right now with a head full of evidence and a story that explains everything, be very careful with your certainty. Certainty feels like clarity. It presents itself as the end of confusion, the resolution of doubt. But certainty that arrives before you've asked the hardest questions is usually just the brain protecting itself from more difficult work. The harder question, the one that costs something, is always, what is my role in this? Not to excuse the other party, not to make yourself the villain where you're not, but to genuinely, honestly, with your ego set aside and your defensiveness set aside and your need to be right set aside, to ask, what have I built here, over time, through accumulated small choices that contributed to this moment? Because here's the thing about 29 years, or however long you've been with whoever you're with, you build something together. The good parts and the bad parts. The warmth and the walls. The habits and the silences. You build all of it together, slowly without fully realizing you're building. The way a house grows different from its original plans as the real conditions of the ground it sits on make themselves known. And somewhere in the building, if you stop paying attention, if you start answering yay without looking up, if you start calling it space when you mean distance, if you start confusing a full schedule with a full presence, something erodes, quietly, slowly, with no dramatic announcement. My wife thought the nanny cam was off after I left. What it recorded changed everything. Claire had needed me, and she had decided, in the quiet of her own mind, that I wasn't there to need. She had drawn that conclusion not from cruelty, but from evidence. Years of evidence. Not fabricated. Not unfair. Real? That's the part I can't argue with. That's the part I had to stay with, and not defend myself against. Here is something I would say to anyone in a marriage that has gone quiet on them. Quiet is not neutral. When the person you built a life with stops bringing you the difficult things, that silence is telling you something. It is not telling you that everything is fine. It is telling you that somewhere along the way, you stopped being the place where the difficult things could go. And the reasons for that are almost always mutual, even when they don't feel that way, even when the evidence points cleanly in one direction. Ask the question before the footage makes you ask it. That's the better version. That's the version where you don't spend 5 days on a pull-out couch eating crackers and watching your wife hold your coffee mug through a phone screen. David is still in treatment. The last report was cautiously optimistic, which is the kind of optimism that comes at a cost. The kind where you learn not to plan too far ahead, but you also learn to be fully in the moments you have. Claire and I fly to Phoenix every few weeks now. We sit with him. We bring food, usually, because David has always had opinions about food, and the hospital cafeteria has violated most of them. We bring books sometimes. His taste in reading is terrible. He reads political thrillers that I find completely implausible. And he reads them at a speed that I find personally offensive. And we argue about this in a comfortable, low-stakes way that I have come to understand is one of the things I love most about being in that room with him. Sometimes we sit with him for a long time without talking, the three of us, watching a game on the small television in the corner of the room, And there is something in that, in the simple animal warmth of being physically present, which is such an obvious thing and which so many of us forget to actually do, that I find I can't put words to. It is not dramatic. It is not poetic. It is just three people in a small room choosing to be there, which turns out to be one of the most significant things a person can do with an afternoon. I talked to David about the camera, eventually told him the whole story. He sat and listened to the whole thing, which cost him something. He gets tired, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You know what's funny?" I said, "What?" He said, "She's been terrified her whole life of being left. Goes back before you. Goes back to when we were kids." He looked at the ceiling. "But she married a man who wouldn't leave, even when she told him to." He looked back at me. I don't think she expected that. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I took my coat off the hook. My coffee mug is still in the cabinet. Claire still doesn't use it. But sometimes, in the morning when I come down and she's already at the kitchen table with her coffee, she looks up when I walk in. All the way up. From what she's reading or what she's thinking. She looks up, and she doesn't say anything, and I don't say anything, and it is, in that specific way, the most conversation we've had in years. That is what I want to leave you with. Not the footage, not the twist, not the resolution that came from a camera catching what it caught. Those are the events, and events are just events. They carry whatever meaning you're willing to do the work to find. What I want you to take is this. You are probably, right now, failing someone in a way you haven't noticed yet. Not maliciously, not even dramatically. You're probably failing them the way I was failing Claire, by being technically present and genuinely absent, by occupying the same rooms without occupying the same life. And the person you're failing has likely made, somewhere in the quiet of their own mind, some decision about whether you're available to them. And that decision has been made based on 1,000 small pieces of evidence you did not intend to give, but gave anyway. The question is whether you find out the way I found out, on a pull-out couch, at midnight watching someone hold your coffee mug. Or whether you find out now, while the room is still quiet enough to have the conversation. Go look up. I mean that exactly as literally as it sounds. If the person you love is standing in a doorway right now or about to, or if they are going through something difficult and you have been answering "yeah" without looking up, set this down, whatever this is, and look up. It is not a guarantee. Nothing is. Looking up is not a cure for 29 years of accumulated distance. But it is the place every recovery has to begin. And it is the only evidence a camera cannot give you. The hardest truth you'll ever face isn't the one other people hide from you. It's the one you've been hiding from yourself. I know that now. I learned it the way most men learn the things that matter, late through consequence, while eating crackers on a pull-out couch and watching something I almost misunderstood completely. But I learned it. And I am not on the pull-out couch anymore. I am at the kitchen table. My coffee is getting cold. Claire is across from me reading something. And in a moment I'm going to put this down and ask her about her day, and I'm going to listen to the whole answer, and I'm going to look at her while she gives it. That's all. That's the whole lesson. It cost me a lot to learn it. I hope it costs you less.